In the Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Fire Knight Impaler build. This is a build that uses Spear of the Impaler. This is an absolutely fantastic weapon, one of my favorites so far. And you get this weapon by defeating Messmer the Impaler and using his remembrance back in Round Table Hold. So this is a great spear weapon, and it does physical and fire damage, has more fire damage than physical depending on where you put your stat points. It's kind of split between Dexterity and Faith, with Dexterity scaling a bit better than Faith in my opinion. However, Faith does affect the fire damage of the weapon's skill, and since the very first attack of the weapon skill is 100% fire damage, I like to prioritize Faith a little bit over Dexterity, although you need a good amount of Dexterity just to use this weapon. Additionally, although I have not done it here, you could prioritize Faith even more when you level up in order to get higher, incantation scaling if you want to mix in incantations with this weapon, if you'd like. I haven't done it here because I've been prioritizing how to get the most damage out of the weapon skill in the weapon itself. And I feel like using like Messmer flame spells, optimizing your talismans and your attributes would be just a little bit different, or you'd have to have very high levels, like maybe 200 or 250 in order to reach optimization for that. So I haven't done that here, but you absolutely could if you want. So I'm going to get into Messmer's Assault, the weapon skill of this weapon, in just a second. But one thing I want to point out about this weapon as well is that you can actually throw this weapon with an R2 or heavy attack or charged heavy attack, and it will launch at an enemy a decent distance. And if you do a fully charged heavy attack, it will actually detonate, dropping magma on the ground, dealing damage over time for a little bit to enemies in the area. Now, I have not built around this. Theoretically, you could if you wanted to, building around this as a throwing weapon. I have tested the Smithing Talisman. It works with this weapon. The Axe Talisman works when you fully charge it. And you can absolutely do this. The thing that I found about this is that the damage drops off the further you get from the target. And it drops off significantly depending on the distance that you are. And this is also not affected by Arrow's Reach Talisman or anything like that. So there's no way to prevent this damage drop off that I've found over distance. You want to be typically a good ways away from an enemy when you're throwing something so they don't close the distance and hit you. And it seems like the damage drop-off kind of prevents you from keeping your damage as high as possible while keeping your spacing as good, which is why I haven't used it. However, you can use it in some boss fights just to get some range damage in. You can run into or dash into an R2 press that will throw a spear, which is nice. And dragons and stuff, you can easily hit their head with this. So I find that there are uses for it, and it still deals decent damage even though we're not optimized for it specifically. So let's talk a little bit about Messmer's Assault, the weapon skill for this. This is an absolutely deadly weapon skill, and what it does is with the first input, it does a fire sweeping attack. Second input does a poke, 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 poke. And third input jumps up and plunges the spear into the ground, and then does a AoE of spears and swords coming out that deals massive damage. And these are 3 separate button presses, so you can stop this chain at any time, allowing you to use a longer combo or a shorter combo depending on what boss you're fighting, which is nice. A lot of combos out there don't allow you to do this. They simply hit multiple times and you kind of get locked in. This one doesn't do that, thankfully. So you have some flexibility on how to use this weapon skill. Now, one of the things I really love about this weapon skill that I think some people are going to overlook is that the fire sweep that it does with the very first press of the, L2 or the weapon skill button, whatever that is for you, does significant damage at significant range. And a lot of times during boss fights or when I'm fighting groups of enemies, I'll simply just use one button press. I won't do the full combo, even though people will be tempted to do this. This conserves FP and often just kills enemies outright. And when you're fighting bosses, sometimes you can only get that one button press in, or you're going to just get absolutely knocked out of the combo anyway. So don't be afraid to use that. Learn how to use this skill, especially when unlocked, to aim it so that you hit multiple enemies at the same time. And as an added bonus, this thing absolutely fucks up fingers. So if you hate the finger enemies, use this weapon. And something else I want to mention about this weapon skill, just so you realize, is that when you plunge the spear into the ground, at the very end of this combo, if you get hit or knocked out of the animation before you pull the spear out and the swords and spears come up, you won't do the damage of that. So keep that in mind, that you have to complete the whole thing, and it can be hard to do. So sometimes you might want to stop after the poke, poke, poke if you can't pull it off. So then when it comes to talismans for this build, I'm simply just using the Erdtree one here because I'm only using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength, since the weapon does physical and fire damage. Flame Grant Me Strength is a great spell. Golden Vow, obviously, buffing damage and defenses, both are very good. Golden Vow has a very good duration, so I typically use this when I'm running around in dungeons and stuff, and I only use Flame Grant Me Strength when I'm facing bosses, etc. Now, if you want to make this like an incantation build on top of it and prioritize Faith more and keep cranking Faith, you could use the Fire Knight Seal and use some of the Messmer spells, because the body piece that we're using for this build also increases the damage of Messmer incantations. So you could do that, and the Fire Knight Seal also boosts Messmer Flame incantation damage, so that would work out really well. You just have to get your Faith a bit higher in order to really see the benefits of it. So then for armor, I have 3 pieces of the Fire Knight set, and I have 1 piece, which is the Winged Serpent Helmet. And the reason I have the Winged Serpent Helmet here is this enhances Fire Knight skills by 10%. Messmer's Assault is considered a Fire Knight skill, so the damage of that is then boosted by this helmet, which is great. The issue with this setup, though, is you only have 41 poise when using this armor, so I had to slot the Bull Goat's Talisman in order to get over that 51 poise breakpoint, so that I'm not staggered out of, every attack that I do, basically. So if you're min-maxing this build, you would probably pick some other armor pieces besides the helm that would get you over that 51 poise. But I really love the style of this armor, and I just couldn't bring myself to change it up. So I slotted the Bull Goat's Talisman instead to get the extra poise. So for other talismans for this build, I have Shard of Alexander, obviously, to increase the damage of Messmer's Assault. That is a no-brainer here. We use that thing all the time. We have Fire Scorpion Charm to increase our fire damage. The weapon does, the way I'm set up here, over 50% fire damage. And it also does fire damage on the first input of the weapon skill, as I mentioned, so that's going to get boosted significantly. So that's good. And I also have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to give me further protection, because I am using the Fire Scorpion Charm. Never really have enough protection for this build, and I find this setup works very, very well for me. Other talismans you can use, as I mentioned, the Axe Talisman will increase the damage of the charged heavy attack when throwing the spear, as will the Smithing Talisman, so if you find yourself using that a lot, you could slot either one of those. And Rotten Wing Sword Insignia or Millicent's Prothesis are both good for this build. You need dexterity, quite a bit of it, for this weapon, so getting that from Millicent's Prothesis is not bad. You build up attack power from using the poke, poke, poke portion of this very fast, so this works very well if you can manage to get that off. But sometimes you can't get it off, so it's, I found that Fire Scorpion Charm was better than it, just because I was getting more reliable damage out of it. And then lastly, you could use the Two-Handed Talisman as well. This isn't going to boost the damage of your weapon's skill, but it will boost the damage of your melee attacks with this weapon when you're two-handing. So that's also something you could use. It just really depends on what you have. Attribute-wise for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 26 Mind, 25 Endurance, 14 Strength, 35 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 60 Faith, and 9 Arcane. We don't need any Intelligence or Arcane. Again, I was an Astrologer, so disregard that. 14 Strength is there to meet the requirements for the weapon. That's the only reason for that there. 50 Vigor is pretty typical of builds at this level. You'll probably want to take this up to 55 or maybe 60 eventually. You won't go higher than that because you get significant drop-off starting at 60, and you get a mild drop-off at 55, so probably want to take that up to 55 at some point. 26 Mind gives us enough to buff and use our weapon skill a lot. I find that if I only use the first input, which I use on trash mobs a lot, I tend to conserve a lot more FP. But if you find yourself using the whole combo this a lot, you're probably going to want more Mind. So if you take this build up higher, definitely consider getting this up to like 35 Mind or so. That'll make your life a lot easier. Golden Vow is expensive to keep buffing with on the landscape, so that does consume a bit of FP as well. This weapon scales pretty well with both Dexterity and Faith. I think Dexterity comes out a bit ahead in terms of damage over Faith, but Faith increases the fire damage, and as I mentioned, I like that first attack that does fire damage, so I have a bit higher Faith. I was also experimenting with incantations with this build, and I think you need to basically have 80 Faith to really make a good use of that. You don't have to have it, but if you're going to cast incantations reliably, you basically have to have about 80 Faith. So if you do want to mix that in, shoot for 80 Faith with this build in order to get more damage out of your incantations. And you're definitely going to, if you don't care about incantations, then you're probably going to prioritize Dexterity after this point, going up to like 50, 60 Dexterity, something like that. And then you can take these both up to 80, which gives you plenty of room to grow with this weapon. Endurance is 25, which is enough to medium roll with this setup. I think more stamina would be good for this build. You do a lot, you use a lot of stamina with the combo, and you also use an insane amount of stamina when you do like a charged heavy attack with this spear. So having more stamina is good. Definitely would consider taking this up to 30 or 35 if you continue to level this build higher. For Flask of Wonders Physique, I have Flame Shroud and Cracked here. This increases fire damage. Again, this increases the damage of that first sweep that I mentioned, which is good. And, subsequent attacks, we still do plenty of fire damage with our melee attacks as well, so that's really nice. And I have the Opaline Hard Tier in here for further damage negation. You could use Stamina Recovery as well. which might make this build a bit easier to play from a stamina perspective. And when it comes to Great Rune for this build, you could use Godric's. You are using 6 out of the 8 stats here, although Strength only needs 14, so it's really more like 5 out of the 8 stats. Or you could use Radons, which would give you more HP, Stamina, and FP. All those things are good for this build, so I think that's probably the best option. So that wraps up my Fire Knight Impaler build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. It's a ton of fun to play. This weapon is absolutely outstanding. You can expect to see other Fire Knight builds on this channel in the future. Obviously, probably not the next couple of builds, but I want to do Fire Knight builds with other Fire Knight weapons as well. So you can expect to see those, and I would love to hear what other builds you guys want to see on the channel. I use those to help figure out what I'm going to do next. And as always, if you have tips or questions, please leave them in the comments, and I will try and answer them as soon as I can.